Well, both the Republican and Democratic tickets are set, and it's possible that the next vice president of the United States is our neighbor. This week, the presumptive Democratic presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, announced Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate. We've got Dan Myers with us. He's in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Minnesota, specializing in voter behavior. And we're going to ask Dan Myers about the Harris-Walz duo and how that might change the minds of voters or not. And we want to hear from you on this as well, 204-780-0893. Want to hear from you and, of course, from Dan about what you think of the Democrat Harris-Walz ticket and how does it stack up against the Republicans, Trump and J.D. Vance? And does it change how you feel about the U.S. election? And what are your hopes and fears as November draws closer? Good afternoon, Dan.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining us. So what did you think when Kamala Harris named Tim Walz as her running mate?
Well, first of all, as a Minnesotan, we've got a lot of state pride, so I was excited by that. On a political level, I think Walz sort of stood out as the safe pick, if that makes sense, for a couple of reasons. The big one, I think, is that he has a much longer electoral track record than a lot of the other contenders for vice president. So he's been elected twice governor here in Minnesota, facing challenges from both the left and the right in those elections. Before that, 12 years as a member of Congress representing a rural district in Minnesota. And all of that sort of electoral seasoning means he's got a lot more experience just doing politics, but also that he's been under media scrutiny for a long time, and there's much less likely to be sort of a surprise or a sort of skeleton in his closet that hasn't appeared before. So I think especially with the short vetting period, the fact that she had weeks instead of months to make this decision, I think that was probably very attractive.
Yeah. You're mentioning the pride of Minnesotans. What are you hearing? Do you think everybody thought he was a shoo-in, or was there a bit of trepidation that might go with someone else?
Minnesotans, as sports fans, have enough experience losing at the last minute, so I don't think anyone had particular expectations that it would actually happen. I think the reaction here was mostly positive. Walz certainly has his detractors here in the state. He, in particular, in the last legislative session, he leveraged a very slim legislative majority to pass a lot of things that the progressives, that folks on the left here in the U.S. had been trying to achieve in Minnesota for a long time. And so that earned him a fair amount of criticism and turned what had been a pretty moderate political record a little bit more leftward. But I think, there's lots of stories coming out about, folks that he taught. He was a high school teacher for, I believe, 24 years. From all accounts, he seems to have been the kind of, inspiring high school social studies teacher that everyone, hopes that their kid has. Stories about him just as a regular guy. I was listening to our public radio yesterday, and they were interviewing folks in his hometown in Mankato, and someone got off on a tangent about how Tim Walz had sold him some CDs once because he was getting rid of some CDs. So, I think Minnesotans on the whole are pretty excited, and Walz does have pretty good popularity within the state. He's sort of more popular, not a lot more popular, but a little more popular than you might expect in a state that's still close to 50-50 in terms of Republicans and Democrats.
Okay. And we want to hear from Manitobans on this as well. Give us a call, 204-780-0893. Yeah, I was going to ask you, Dan, about whether this would solidify Minnesota as a blue state, having Walz as the running mate.
So I think almost certainly political scientists have done research looking at what's the effect of a vice presidential pick on voting in that candidate's home state. And it's not a huge effect. We see that ticket usually gets about 1% more of the vote. Obviously, there's a lot of variability there depending on the candidate, but on average, about 1% of the vote. But Minnesota's already leaning pretty blue, and so that extra 1% probably puts it safely in the Democratic column. Maybe more importantly, though, any world where Donald Trump wins Minnesota is almost certainly a world where he also wins Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And so the election would be well in the Republicans' hand before Minnesota's votes were counted.
Yeah. Well, you were mentioning that he had a pretty long track record in electoral politics and so on. And but otherwise, at least a lot of Canadians, and I would say probably a lot of Americans, don't know that much about him. But as you say, he also doesn't seem to have any skeletons in his closet because he's been dealing with the media for quite a long time. So given the short length of time that Kamala Harris had to choose, would that have been a factor in, like, let's just, name the top 5 things these people have to have and sort of shorten the list?
Yeah, I think that was definitely a factor. You saw very early on the reporting on her vice presidential selection process. She was interested in a governor. She, I think, correctly wanted somebody who could project a more moderate image and someone to balance out, her Californianess, frankly, her femaleness and her non-whiteness also. And so, Tim Walz is about as much of a Midwestern white guy as you can get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, interesting. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, Troy just called him a question that's kind of relevant to what you're just saying. He wants to know how important the male vote is in this upcoming election. He notices Trump is trying to appeal to men, but how important is it to court men specifically? And is Walz maybe someone of interest from that point of view?
Yeah, so we have seen in the Trump era a widening gender divide in the U.S. In terms of women tending to vote more Democratic and Republicans tending to vote, or men tending to vote more Republican. It's not as extreme as some people might think. There are plenty of Republican women and there are plenty of Democratic men. But the gender divide has occurred, and I think you can see the source of that in some of Trump's policy stances, but also just style and rhetoric. I'm a little skeptical. I think that may have been a factor driving the pick of Walz. I'm a little skeptical that it will actually make a difference. We don't see a lot of evidence that. For example, the 2 occasions when a female vice president has been picked, a vice presidential candidate has been picked, that helped that ticket, particularly with women. So I'm a little skeptical that actually has much of an influence on the vote of men as men. But that gender divide is a real factor in American politics and something that I think is top of mind for a lot of political strategists. And
what about, I heard the phrase or read the phrase generational chemistry being a factor with Kamala Harris choosing Tim Walz, that there was some sort of chemistry between them. Is that important with your running mate?
That's interesting. I hadn't heard it referred to in that way, but the chemistry is very important. I think one thing that it's very easy to overlook in the midst of an election is probably the most important part of picking a vice president is that you're picking your potential the vice president if you win. And so you're picking someone who you'll be working with for 4 or possibly 8 years should you win the election. Someone who you have to count on to, help advance your agenda, someone who you trust to bring things to the table. And also, quite frankly, someone who you trust to be president if something should happen to you. And unfortunately, we've seen very recently, political violence in the U.S. that almost took out a presidential candidate. So that's all, I think, much more important than people give it credit for. I think people tend to focus on the kind of narrow electoral considerations for this election. But chemistry in general between the running mates is really important because they're going to be coworkers for 4 years.
Yeah. Give us a call with your thoughts, 204-780-0893. And Dan, I also wanted to ask you, how stark is the contrast with the Republican pairing of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance versus what they tend to represent versus Harris and Walz?
Yeah, so the pick of J.D. Vance by Trump was very much reinforcing things about Trump. He picked somebody, and this maybe gets to the previous point. He picked someone who is clearly going to carry on the Trumpian legacy in the Republican Party. So I think that does set up a very strong contrast with the Democratic ticket. Walz perhaps is a bit more of a moderate than Harris in terms of policy views, and perhaps does something to sort of bring a more moderate tinge to the Democratic ticket than as opposed to reinforcing Harris's reputation, at least as being rather liberal. But yeah, I think that really does set up a sharp contrast on a lot of important issues, taxes, healthcare, whether the Affordable Care Act here, which expanded almost universal healthcare in the U.S., will continue to be the law, policy on immigration, all of these things. You have really sharp contrast between the two candidates. Mm-hmm. Or the two tickets, and also on a level of just sort of vision. If you listen to J.D. Vance's speeches or Trump's speeches, it paints a pretty dark picture of where America is right now. Harris and Walz are painting a much more optimistic picture of America and its prospects. And so those are, voters will have to think about which of those they find more appealing as visions for the country. Only in America, but in a good way, is what they're saying, I guess. We have Brenda on the line. Brenda, what's your question?
I actually didn't have a question.
Oh, your comment would be good.
Yeah, I like the Harris-Walz combination. I think that the optimism and, as they put it, joy that they're selling is a sure win thing. I think that the United States and a lot of people across the world have had just about enough of the negativity and have been, I don't know, I kind of felt like the day after Harris got the nomination, there was a big sigh that went up across the country and the world of relief, just kind of like the sigh of relief that happened when Trudeau took over from Harper in Canada. Everybody went, phew, we're glad that's over, And I think that if she wins and she manages to navigate in the minefield of possible nefarious attempts to steal the election back, that it's going to mean a positive decade coming for the world and for and for the United States. I only want to see the same thing happen in Canada. I'd like to see the populists in Canada come up against a wall of optimism, and people realize that they're being sold lies and they're being told that Canada is broken, just like Trump is telling the United States how messed up they are. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that. I believe Canada is one of the most wonderful countries in the world, and we need to develop some resistance to that kind of propaganda that we're subjected to as well.
Well, thanks very much, Brenda. You have hope. That's good.
I think we all should have hope right now. We got to ride that wave.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being with us on Radio Noon. And now we're going to go to Wayne Anderson. He is the Reeve of the RM of Piney, which is very close to the U.S. border, and Minnesota has a special relationship there. Hi, Wayne.
Hello.
So what's your community's connection to the U.S.? I hinted at it a bit there.
Well, our RM of Piney is rural municipality of Piney is right along the border, and it's quite east. It's like on the east edge of Manitoba, mm-hmm. And so our closest neighbors, of course, is northern Minnesotans,
right?
And a lot of our residents are dual citizens, and people in Minnesota or in RM of Piney have friends and family on both sides of the border. So we travel back and forth a lot there.
Very close neighbors. So what do you think of Tim Walz being chosen as Harris's running mate?
Well, I've been Reeve here for 10 years, and we've had both Democrat and Republican, and so we're nonpartisan, and we kind of get along with everybody. We are friends in the U.S. Mm-hmm. We don't talk about it much.
Is that right?
just everyday living. Yeah.
Everybody just kind of keeps it on the down low since you're going back and forth across the border all the time. You want to stay friends with everybody?
Correct. Yeah. The only trouble is we have with the various governments, like the federal and the U.S. government, is border regulations. So that's about the only way is.
Right. So a lot of people from the arm of Piney work at the Polaris plant in Russo. Do you think they would have some opinions? What are you hearing?
Well, of course, everybody has their political opinions. Watching American politics is very interesting for a lot of us. And,
were you surprised when Walz was chosen?
Yes, we were quite surprised, and we're happy for Minnesota.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for being with us, Wayne. Good to talk to you.
No problem. Thank you.
That's from the RM of Piney. We were speaking with the Reeve there. Dan, I've got tons of questions for you. I find this absolutely fascinating. So just before, I think we've got a couple minutes left here. So Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, he was mentioned a lot early on. And what would he have brought to the ticket, and why was he ultimately passed over?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Shapiro, again, if you're thinking about sort of the very obvious electoral implications, Pennsylvania is very likely to be the state that decides the presidential election. And again, we see that vice presidential candidates have a small positive impact on that their parties share the vote in their home state. And so, if you pick someone like Shapiro, you can sort of, you got a little bit of a better chance in Pennsylvania. Not a huge chance, but or better chance, but a little bit of an improvement there. I think my guess, and again, I think it'll be interesting as we see more reporting on Harris's decision making in this, is some of it was concerned about Shapiro's relatively brief record in public office. So he was Attorney General of Pennsylvania for 4 years, and he's been governor for less than 2 years at this point. He's really only been through one high scrutiny statewide election. And you did see some things coming out as he was being vetted as a vice, by the media as a vice presidential candidate. That not terrible things, but potentially things that would cause some problems on the electoral trail. So my guess is part of it is just more comfort with Walz's experience and the degree to which he's already been through this a lot.
Yeah, and also, your expertise, or some of your expertise, is in voter behavior. Having this pairing, how can that? Do you think it'll affect voter behavior in regular patterns? Will it change from the last election? What do you think?
Well, the primary thing about American politics and American voter behavior these days is that we're a very polarized country, and so nothing changes anything very much. So I don't think that this will change it very much. This is a safe pick. I think to the extent Walz is perceived, and one challenge in projecting this is that Walz doesn't have a national profile. Most people outside of Minnesota don't know who he is until 48 hours ago, and so his image that will develop is important. If he's seen favorably and if he's seen as someone who's competent, then that reflects well on Harris. People will think, okay, Harris has better judgment than I thought, or Harris is maybe a little more moderate than I thought, or I just like Harris more because she picked a good guy. And so around the margins, that might have some impact on voters who are less engaged, are more likely to stay home, or less ideological, and so they're divided between the tickets, or who maybe were considering casting a protest vote for Kennedy or someone like that. But again, we're talking at the margins here, but it's going to be a very close election, so those margins are important.
And then how important is it to physically get voters out, and which party is better at doing that?
Oh, well, that is a long-standing question and a difficult answer. I think it is important, presidential elections in the U.S. have seen a big uptick in turnout over the last 20 years. And I think a lot of that is that both parties have gotten a lot better at voter mobilization, at getting their voters out. And that's I think mostly a positive change that they're focused on that. I do think sometimes folks contrast the persuasion versus mobilization of voters. And the thing to recognize about people who are on the edge of maybe voting